Hi, welcome to our week 4. It's week 4, and this is my highlight video. Looking back at last week, our main topic was truth. One of my favorite chapters in An Ethical Life. Kite talks about 3 requirements in determining truth. And they are responsibility, the idea that we have a moral responsibility to understand what is true to the best of our ability. That there are several things that we need to acknowledge that exist that prevent us from seeing the truth, even when we're faced with it. And specifically, those things are self-deception, which is our natural tendency to keep uncomfortable truths hidden from ourselves. It's not something that only bad people do. It's that actually is just something that we as humans try to hide the uncomfortable truths. The second thing we need to acknowledge is that power makes it easier for us to control what information reaches us. So the more power you have, the more control you have over the information you receive. And a great example that he gives of that is like in a corporation, the CEO, his office, usually there are several doors and several people that you have to go through in order to actually speak in person to the CEO. And so that's just a more of a physical example of how the more power you have, the easier it is to keep those uncomfortable truths from being spoken to. And then the third thing that we need to acknowledge is that we all have bias. No matter how much we try to avoid bias or remove it from our life, everybody has some sort of bias. We are all partial in some way, depending on issues or circumstances. And an example of how bias affects the truth and how we see the truth is the concept of confirmation bias, that we have a tendency to accept information that supports beliefs that we hold, and likewise that we have a tendency then to discount any information that may challenge the beliefs that we currently hold. So those biases tend to keep, how do I put this? They tend to make us want to keep our current belief systems that we try to not change, and our biases are kind of what the door is to keeping truth away from us, in order that we can be transformed by the truth and maybe have a shift in belief. Because for the most part, most people either don't like change or find change hard, and so we don't want information that's going to change our beliefs. So acknowledging those things is the second requirement that we have in determining the truth. And the final requirement is discernment. And discernment is knowing where to look for the truth, and then knowing how to sort through all of the information that's out there. Especially in this age of the internet, we have such great access to information, both false and truthful information. So really being discerning about what is the truth and what's the junk. And he offers 3 different strategies, I guess you could call them, in discerning what's true. And the first is just the ability to read. And I remember when I first read this in Kite, I thought he was talking about like the ability to read a book. And actually that is part of it, but it's more so the idea of the ability to read situations, recognizing the meaning in things, the meaning in actions or nonverbal communication, like I said, the situational things, as well as being able to read for between the lines, subcontext in something, and also just being able to understand scholarly work. So being able to read things on a number of levels and recognizing what the true meaning is for what we are reading. The second strategy for discernment is evaluating the sources where we're getting our information from. So he suggests that we need to ask ourselves, does the source have any conflicts of interest? For instance, is the paper, the scientific paper that we're reading, was it funded by a special interest group? So if it's a paper on climate change and the research for this paper was funded by the oil industry, there's a conflict of interest there, especially if that research is showing that there isn't any significant ties between drilling and environmental decline. So that would be one thing to ask yourself, conflicts of interest. The second thing would be, is the source trustworthy and reputable? For instance, one of my favorite things to read occasionally on the internet is The Onion. But The Onion is not a reputable source for truth. They tend to lampoon things and do a very good job of oftentimes making things seem as if they're truthful until you read further in the article and then you realize that this is a lampoon. So, as opposed to the U.S. News and World Report, the National Enquirer would not be a reputable source. So, and they're across the internet. There's all sorts of different websites, some of which have a reputation of providing sound information that has been researched by their staff, and others that seem to exist simply to misinform. So, and then the third thing in evaluating sources is to ask if the information is confirmable. And what that means is it can, for instance, a research paper, they'll cite other research papers that they, in the literature review. And so you can go back, you can look at the bibliography of the works cited, and you can look at those papers and confirm the facts that the research paper that you're looking at is using to support their claims. Another way that you can confirm information is, let's say it's a scientific paper and they make a conclusion based upon the experiment data that they got from the experiment, and then if you can look at other similar studies, and those studies, the information, the data that was generated from a similar experiment produce similar data, then that's another way of confirming it, that the experiment was replicable. In fact, that's something that as you get into research methodology, if you get into that towards the end of your college career, the idea of taking some research and trying to replicate that research is actually it's something that helps scientists and researchers to verify information and to legitimize it, when they're trying to evaluate sources. Then the third strategy that Kite recommends for discernment is evaluating arguments. And there are several different types of false arguments. So for instance, when you're listening to a political debate, this is a great way. You'll hear all of these types of false arguments. So it's a way of, I like to use it to get a feel for who is actually using rational thought when they are talking about an issue, as opposed to just saying inflammatory things or things off the cuff, just offering an opinion that isn't really based on anything. So the first type of false argument is called the false dilemma, and that is when you state or you assume that there are only two sides to an issue, when in fact there are actually it's a multifaceted issue, which quite honestly, most issues aren't just black and white, two-sided. Most issues have lots of views between, one side and the other. And so you have to, a truthful argument will recognize that it's not and or, that there's gray area in between. The second type of false argument is called the straw man argument, and it is when a person, instead of let's put it this way. The person misrepresents the position in order to successfully argue against it. So they'll kind of skew or twist their opponent's position in a way that it makes it easier for them to present an argument against it. But it's not really the true position. All right, so that, and then there's a third false argument that's called ad hominem, which is Latin, for, if I'm going to remember this correctly, for human. And the person focuses on their opponent instead of on the claim that the opponent is making. And quite honestly, you see this quite a bit in the current political discourse. It seems like the different party candidates, instead of focusing on the issues, are often just going towards picking on the person, whether it's like outright making fun of the person or picking on their habits, instead of talking about the issues and what their stances are on the issues. The fourth false argument is an appeal to authority. And this is when someone will cite an authority who is not really qualified to give an expert opinion on the topic at hand. A form of this appeal to authority was used quite a bit in the 80s on television. You remember the saying, I'm not a doctor, but I play one on TV, and then they tell you about some over-the-counter drug that they're recommending. So in that instance, they're banking on a false authority that they have, that, they're your favorite soap opera doctor, but they're not really a doctor, and so why should they be giving you advice about the best antacid on the market or whatever. So that's one form of that appeal to authority. Another that you might see, I watch courtroom TV sometimes, and there will be court cases where they'll bring in an expert witness that's either a scientist or a doctor, but they're not the type of scientist or doctor that really should be giving an opinion on the evidence that they're giving an opinion on. So that would be another example. All right, and then the fifth type of invalid or false argument is just insufficient evidence, and this is when you use research to support a claim that extends beyond the legitimate range of the evidence. So, for instance, you get this a lot in the health world, where like a company will say, oh yeah, they'll cite some research that says that like green tea provides you with lots of antioxidants that combat free radicals, so therefore green tea is a cure for cancer. That doesn't work. There's insufficient evidence to say that green tea is a cure for cancer. Yes, there is evidence that green tea does provide some really good antioxidants, and antioxidants do combat free radical damage, which there's other evidence that shows that free radicals contribute to cancer formation, but to just string that all together and say that green tea cures cancer, there's not sufficient evidence to show that. So those are all of the things that one needs to do in determining what the truth is when they're doing decision making. And I just found this really interesting because, these are all things that to me were pretty common sense. But I didn't ever really, lay it out like this, that I need to consider all these things when I'm making decisions, especially, substantial decisions, whether they're work decisions, family decisions, personal decisions. You really want to consider all these things when you are doing decision making. And once again, this is just a fourth of that picture. There will be looking at consequences, fairness, and character in upcoming chapters. All right, so getting to this coming week. The learning focus for week 4 is consequences, and then living the big picture. We're wrapping up the A Soul of a Citizen, and that's really kind of how he ends the book is talking about how we can't focus on the minutia. We need to look at the big picture, and how do we live in the big picture. And then there also is other themes that Loeb talks about besides, the living in the big picture is the idea that change is slow and you need patience. Hope is a really important thing to embrace, because of the patience that is needed. The idea that if you focus on this being a journey towards growth and transformation, as opposed to just focusing on, I'm advocating this thing and I need to see change and I need to see it in now and it needs to be a big change. That's where you're going to get your frustration and overwhelm from, and burnout. And if you just focus more on the journey and allowing your advocacy work and your participation in the community to help you grow and help you change, that is where kind of like the catalyst for change outside of yourself will happen. And then he ends the book with a postscript that is called the 10 Suggestions. And these are like 10 big takeaways that he's hoping you get from the book. So take a look at that as well. So that's your reading assignment for this week is in Loeb is chapter 12 and the postscript. Besides that, Kite chapter 4 is on consequences, and you'll be reading about the significance of consequences and looking at, are some consequences more significant than others. We'll be learning some kind of philosophical things about pleasure and pain. So the positive consequences would fall within the pleasure spectrum, whereas the negative consequences would fall within the pain spectrum. He talks a little bit about the concept of happiness and what happiness really means, and then how there's a subjectivity to consequences. So for instance, with happiness, how happiness is really a subjective thing. It's difficult to look at someone and say, oh, they're happy. How happy are they? Or what is their definition? You have your definition of happy, but would they say they're happy? Because they maybe have a different definition of happy. Or, and then you've got a scale of happiness, and, maybe I think they're here on the scale of happiness, but in reality, they think they're way up here. So it really is a subjective thing. He talks about the challenge of prediction with consequences. And so when you are doing the 4-way method of ethical decision making, how predicting what consequences are going to happen and how they're going to affect people, you can't be 100% right. You can't totally accurately predict those sort of things. So how to deal with that. And then also talking about, when you're identifying who will be affected by a decision, who is that who and how. It's not just human beings, but you also need to think about animals and inanimate objects even. So, which is kind of interesting because we don't always think about all of those aspects of who might be affected by a decision. So that's our reading for this week. We're back to 2 discussion boards. The first is on our service learning projects. So we're kind of, hopefully you guys are have been working hard at getting those 8 instances of service completed with your community partners, and so we're kind of get back in discussing that with each other. So what you're asked to do is to relate some specific aspect of your experience with your community partner to either something that you read about in Loeb chapter 12, The Fullness of Time, or something that you've learned in our reading on ethics so far in An Ethical Life. And then once you've related that something from your experience to something in one of those books, then talk about how it affects you. And for this discussion board, I'll be using the online discussion rubric to grade it, and that is in the Adult Learner's Guide on page 26. And then the second discussion board is on sand mining, like frack sand mining here in Wisconsin. So for this one, you're asked to research issues around frack sand mining in Wisconsin using a variety of media resources. And here's a great opportunity for you to start using some of that discernment in where to find truthful information and how to sort through all of the information that you do encounter. You're asked to talk about what the positive and negative consequences of frack sand mining are, and then who do these various consequences affect, both the positive and the negative. Who do they affect? When you are considering the 4-way method of ethical decision making, what do you think about the decisions that are currently being made in regards to this issue? And that could be on a government level, that could be on a local level. Maybe you have, maybe you live in a neighborhood that is affected directly by this. It could be decisions that are being made by the mining companies. It's up to you, but focus on some current decision that has been made around frack sand mining, and when you apply the 4-way method to it, what's your assessment of the decision that's been made? And then what ethics principles that you've learned about so far in KITE, how do you see those at work in the issue? So those are the things to talk about in your discussions, and I'll be using the current event discussion rubric, which is found in the Adult Learner's Guide on page 27. Besides the discussion boards, you're to complete writing deliberation paper 5, and this is the one that you started this past week. The guiding questions are: is the United States a nation of followers? And why is stepping outside of the box or living counterculturally for the benefit of the common good so difficult? In this paper, you're asked to summarize what you learned in Loeb chapters 7, 8, and 9 to answer those 2 governing questions. And those are the chapters on values, work and family, village politics, and widening the circle. And then you're asked to reflect upon the lessons that you learned from reading these chapters and talk about future actions that you're prompted to take from what you've learned. And just a reminder that for the deliberation papers, to make sure you use at least 3 outside resources in support of your opinions to get full points on that grading criteria. And deliberation paper 5 is due Sunday, April 10th. Also due on April 10th is the final Q&A question for Loeb, and it's on chapter 12 and the postscript. So, and I think I already said that that's due on April 10th. So that is what we have coming up for this week in a nutshell. As always, you know how to get in touch with me with your questions, and I look forward to reading papers and discussion boards in the coming week. Thanks.